Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
Brian Chasnoff, reporter.
And before we get started, I wanted to extend our thoughts to the family of Lila Cockrell, who was an iconic figure in San Antonio, a mayor for 8 years, from 1975 to 81, and then later from 1989 to 1991. And she passed away last Thursday at the age of 97, the first woman mayor in the history of San Antonio, and the person who kind of helped the city navigate its way into single-member districts and the kind of more democratic form of city government that we have now. One of her most prominent successors in the mayor's office was Julián Castro, who, of course, later became the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and is currently the first San Antonian ever to run as a major party candidate for president of the United States. And we are so lucky today to have the campaign manager for Julián Castro's presidential campaign, Maya Rupert. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And I won't be, before we start firing questions at you, I wanted to just to give our listeners an idea of your history before you took on this task. You were policy director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. You were senior policy advisor at Department of Housing and Urban Development, working with Julián Castro there. Senior director for policy at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and you also were the executive director for Opportunity First, which was the political action committee that Julián Castro created. So I know you've been in San Antonio for several months. I want to apologize for the heat, but putting that aside, what have your impressions been of the city? You grew up in California. It's a very, I guess there's certain cultural similarities, but
absolutely. I grew up in the desert too, in California, a small town called Yucca Valley. So there are some similarities, definitely. I think y'all do have us beat a little bit on the heat, especially at night. It cools down, like in the high desert at night.
But not here.
It does not cool down. That is something I'm learning. But no, honestly, I like it a lot. I really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. I feel like folks are really friendly. I have a lot of conversations with strangers, which I really appreciate. I love the food. It's been a really good time.
Now, how many people do you have working in San Antonio as part of the campaign team?
So our team at this point, I think nationwide, I should know this number, but we're growing, so I don't anymore. I think nationwide, so here at our headquarters, we also have staff in Nevada, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. I think nationwide, we're probably somewhere around 35. And are just starting to make hires for organizing. So we're building our organizing programs in the early stage. So that number's about to go way up because we'll have a lot of folks on the ground.
Is it fair to say that this is like a 7-day-a-week, pretty much like from the moment you wake till you go to sleep? I mean, the job never stops.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's busy. It is all encompassing, but.
Now, you all are in the process of preparing for the third round of presidential debates. The third debate will be September 12th, and Julián Castro was one of the 10 candidates to qualify for that debate. Has the preparation begun, or where are you all in that process?
Yeah, he's also going to be on a CNN town hall on climate on the 4th.
Right.
And so we just rolled out our climate justice plan and resilience plan today. So a lot of our prep has actually focused on that and making sure that he, is prepared to go talk to folks about, the potential impacts of climate change and the existential threat that it presents. So prepping for that also is, kind of prepping for the debate, because obviously I think this is something that's on voters' minds. And so we anticipate him talking about that night as well. So yeah, we've definitely started that process. He's rolled out. It's funny, because when people say how long we've been doing this, you mentioned that it's, we were talking earlier, we had a rally here in San Antonio in April. It's, we've been doing this for 8 months now. I never think of it in those terms because it feels like it's going so fast. But when you do the math, it's been so long. And in that time, he's rolled out a lot of really in-depth policies. So when we start sort of talking about debate, one of the big things is just making sure it's like, we have to go back and remind ourselves, oh, right, we have a policy on this. And, we really have been able to cover a lot of issues. And so trying to just, figure out how to get those into a conversation like a debate.
What's your take on the poll numbers? Because they haven't really shifted all that much overall for anyone in the race, with a few exceptions. Is that indicative of something that's going to stay pretty steady over the next few months, or is there?
I think it's still so early in this process. People aren't voting until February. I think a lot of people, it's hard when we work in politics, write about politics, are in it. It feels like this has been going on forever. But for a lot of folks, they're not going to start tuning in and like actually making decisions about who they're supporting for a while still. So at this stage, a lot of polls are just name ID. And we knew he had a little bit lower name ID. And so what we're seeing is as people get to know him, they like him. Yeah. So I feel very encouraged by the trajectory that we see in the polls.
And we, as you said, we now kind of think of the presidential race as something almost like a 4-year cycle or something. Right. But, people have pointed out that at this same stage in 2003, Joe Lieberman was leading the Democratic field, and it didn't go so well for him. And I think Bill Clinton didn't actually announce for 92 until like October of 91, which seems kind of bizarre now because I guess back then people would just enter the race a little later than.
Absolutely. You could enter the race later. There wasn't the expectation of, it was, I think it was actually 2015, August, the first debate. Right. Was between. Right. So it was like, everything has just moved up so much. And with, the debates moving up, that means people are rolling out policy and talking about a lot of these issues so much sooner. And so there is this artificial sense that, the field is being set. And I think what we're seeing is, we're definitely seeing that sort of winnowing that a lot of people have predicted. There are only 10 people on the stage in September. And so I think what you're going to start seeing is a lot of people who are starting to sort of tune in now, and we're as we sort of enter this next phase, what we see on the ground is belied by what we see in the polls, right? We see a lot of momentum and a lot of energy. And one of the tough things I think about the focus on the polls really, I think for a lot of us is just getting to the next debate stage, right? Sure. The hard part about polling is that it doesn't allow you to capture sort of excitement within communities that maybe aren't being oversampled, and therefore their actual share of the vote is not really going to be reflected. We see a lot of excitement among young people. We see a lot of excitement within communities of color. We're seeing this. But when we're out in Iowa, he's pulling these big crowds. So I definitely think that the polls play a role in what they're doing right now, but they really can only reflect exactly what's going on in a moment. They don't get that picture.
Now, could you talk a little bit about when first meeting Julián Castro? Were you already at HUD at that point, or did you meet him before that?
No, I met him when I was at HUD. Okay. I did not know him before.
Okay, because I've read a couple of accounts. I think one account said that you were with the Center for Lesbian Rights and talked to him about trans issues, but I think you were talking to him about that when you were actually at HUD, right?
I was at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and I worked on a rule, but this was before he came. Right. So the first time I actually interacted with him, I was working for HUD.
What were your impressions of him when you first met him, just as a person, and what stood out to you about him?
He was incredibly thoughtful. Like, I thought he was sort of very clearly deliberate, right? Because what was happening was I was kind of presenting a rule to him, and his, he just kind of went quiet. He was listening, and then he stopped me, and he asked these questions that were like, he so clearly had been, he's somebody who listens intently and then comes back. It was like one thing I was like, oh, wow. It became clear I was talking to a lawyer. Like, you definitely had that. I thought he was just incredibly smart. But I also I was taken by the fact that this was a politician. And in my mind, politicians were not sort of like, there were like social justice people and there are like political people.
Interesting.
And we could work together, but we weren't the same kind of people. And the fact that his reaction to me sort of talking about this rule and specifically about protecting trans folks trying to access shelters was to see how many people he could protect was really moving for me. I really felt like, oh, wow, this is a politician who I feel like has this framework where he wants to talk about justice and he wants to actually talk about people who are being marginalized. And that was really moving for somebody who didn't think that was sort of the political realm.
Now, running for president, you have to go big sometimes, right, on stage. And I think a lot of people who have covered Castro, myself included, kind of have noted he's more reserved in character. Yes. Has that been difficult for him to really really step out and project. He did it. I mean, when he went after Beto in that first debate, that was a moment where it was somewhat unexpected for people who know him well. Has that been hard for him to step out like that?
No, I think he actually is he has that in him. He does come across as very reserved. That was another thing I was going to say. It's something that struck me when I first met him is he's quiet.
Yes.
Right.
And I'm not.
You should be running.
No. But I mean, that dynamic, sometimes it's like for like a not quiet person to meet a quiet person, I'm like, oh, this could go one of two ways.
Yeah.
But the thing is that as you get to know him, the thing is he is definitely reserved. He does tend to be more quiet, and he's definitely more sort of introverted. But that introversion is it's sort of thoughtfulness, but it's not actually. I think that people tend to think of it as he's being timid,
right?
And that's not what's happening, right? That it's like he is thoughtful, he is deliberate, and so he's more quiet. But the boldness you see is also naturally him.
Right. No, he's got strong ideas, and he makes sharp points, even within that framework of being quiet.
Right. And so I think what he's been able to do in the cycle, which I think has been really cool, and something I don't know that we've gotten to see as many in different cycles. I do think that a lot of times the model we have for politicians is very specific, and I think we're getting to see more brands in this cycle, which is pretty cool. And I think for him, that brand really is that genuine. He is genuinely sort of bold, but he is able to do it with his demeanor is much more sort of. Because he's quieter, I think that makes him kind of, for a lot of people, it's more approachable. So he has these really bold ideas that he is able to still kind of reach out to people. One of the things that we hear a lot is that when he goes to different communities making the exact same points, and people would expect him, for example, to go in front of a super progressive audience and talk about police violence, right? But they wouldn't necessarily expect that if he is going to like a majority white community in Iowa, but he's making the same points and he's getting the same reception because he's able to deliver these really bold, really passionate points with this demeanor that makes people feel like I'm meeting you where you are, and I'm assuming that we have a core set of values, which is a very cool thing to see somebody sort of able to lean into.
Now, you talked about how before you met him, you had this idea about there are people who are activists or social justice people, and they're politicians, and they're like two different worlds. And you come from the activist world, and you had a background as a lawyer, and you had been involved on policy on the policy front, and then you're now being asked to run a political campaign. Can you talk about roughly when he approached you about doing that, and was your initial reaction, this is not my thing, or what? How did you feel about it?
When he decided he wanted to do it, I had left my job at the Center for Reproductive Rights to go help him with the PAC, with the understanding that he was making this decision and I was going to be with him regardless in some capacity if he did it. So after he made the decision to do it, we talked about this a lot because we have such a close relationship. I am, the sort of the first person he brought onto the team, and so my thought was, great, I can help you find a campaign manager. I'm glad I came on board so early so I can help with
Maya,
that
this
process.
is a little bit like the Dick Cheney thing.
Yeah,
where he was like,
same
I will
thought,
find a running mate for you, George W. Bush, and it's me. But I don't think in this case you actually were the person seeking it out. But
you don't strike me as quite as devious as Dick
that's
Cheney.
right. That's right.
It genuinely wasn't like that because I didn't think of myself as sort of a manager, in part because my background is policy, and while policy is a piece of campaigning, it has never been thought of as sort of the core piece. But the more we talked about how he wanted to run and the things that he wanted to do, he wanted an issue-based campaign. He wanted something that was going to really, in a field this crowded, one of the first things he wanted to do was, I want to give people a genuine sense of what I'm going to do to make their lives better. And if you have giant name ID, you can just go make press doing whatever you want to do. But one of the things that you have to think about when you're a smaller team and fighting for attention is, all right, what are the things that are actually going to resonate with people? And so we made the decision to run a campaign like this. I started seeming like a choice that made more sense. I did still honestly have reservations about it because I just kind of felt like this is a world that I haven't done before. There are going to be pieces that feel familiar. On some level, a campaign is an organization of people, and I've run organizations, right? You know what I mean? Like so that part was like, okay, I can do sort of management stuff, but there are going to be places where I have gaps.
What has been the hardest part for you?
It's the stuff that is sort of so specifically campaign related, right? Like the first time I had a conversation with our Iowa state director, I was seriously just like, okay, wait, really walk me through what a caucus is. Like, why do we still vote that way?
I still struggle with that, and after all these years,
and I realized part of the question is revealing the answer that, I mean, these are that this is an old-fashioned way that doesn't all right. But some of it was just a lack of familiarity with it. But it's the stuff like that. It's stuff like, walk me through what a field program is really supposed to be and like what goals make sense. Those I feel like are the kinds of questions that I ask like our senior team a lot, is like, all right, like this would be my thought. React to that. Is this a reasonable goal?
Beginner's mind. Maybe that's what he needs, right?
Right. I mean, like sometimes, and that's the thing. I do think there's a little bit of doing it exactly the way we've done it before. Maybe this cycle is not the way to do that. And so, a lot of our senior team is newer. We have people from who are bringing in different perspectives, and so we do challenge, I think, the status quo a little more often, which has been good. But we also have a good mix of folks that have done this before who can say, okay, are we being sufficiently ambitious if we say we're going to do this? Or are we being unrealistic if we say we're going to do this?
I think one of the things that's been interesting about the campaign, too, is that in building the team, I think he tried to model this is all the things that I want to see happen in the country. I'm going to model that with my campaign. What, $15 an hour minimum wage for the campaign team, right? Encouraging people in the campaign to unionize, wanting to have young people, wanting to have a diversity. I'm guessing that's something that you all talked about too, that all these things were important, that we want to sort of establish this kind of model.
Absolutely. That was one of the sort of conversations we had early on and commitments I made to him, that I was like, we are going to run an organization with as little daylight as possible between your positions and how we operate. Mm-hmm. In part because I think it is a really good way to signal to people, this is the kind of leader he'll be. You can see how someone's going to be by the organization that they build up around them. And so we want to reflect, this is what his leadership in practice looks like. And then also I think, both he and I have also talked about just, some of the things that kind of informed our early experiences. We wanted to make sure that we, sort of corrected or did not replicate. Like, one of the things I always say is that, I went into social justice work and I definitely, liked that path. But there were moments that I was like, oh, wow, politics seems like a really interesting career path. But it honestly didn't seem like a possible one for me because I could not have afforded to work for free. Mm-hmm. And that was the norm for a long time, right? Like you intern for free, you get enough experience to get jobs on campaigns, and that's kind of how you come up through the world. Right. And so we can't kind of look at a non-diverse pool of people who have campaign experience and feign shock if we're not paying people, right? So that was something that we committed to early on. That was like, we're work deserves to be paid, and we also want to build a field where a lot of people can actually participate, and that means you have to pay.
So when you look at the front runners like Biden and Warren, you see a schism there between the most important thing, the only important thing is to get rid of Trump versus get rid of Trump and revolutionize society. I think I know the answer to this, but for the record, what side does Castro fall more on?
That we have to, that it's not just enough to win back the White House from Trump, mm-hmm. that we need to be trying to win forward, right? That we don't, we can't have a moment like this, have somebody like Donald Trump actually get into power and then think that the best way to make sure it never happens again is just to sort of go back to before he got there. Because the fact of the matter is Trump is a symptom of a deeper issue. And so what we need to start doing as progressives has been the entire, sort of theory of Secretary Castro's sort of his theory of change on this is that, we need this is a moment for us to, as progressives, start actually fighting for how things would be, how we actually want things to be, as opposed to sort of being wedded to the way we have told ourselves over and over again some things aren't possible.
There seems to be a palpable fear that going too far into the realm of revolution will scare off voters and get Trump reelected. Is it what's the balance there? Is that something that Castro worries about?
I mean, we talk about that a lot, but the thing is, and I think it goes back to the, he's making the same arguments everywhere he goes, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's not this he has not bought into, I think, the false choice that you can either appeal to, voters in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, who we didn't get in 2016, or you can fire up a young progressive base. That it is entirely possible to take those sort of core values and messages and get to both. Because a lot of I think there's this idea of people are going to get scared and not vote, right? But when it really comes down to what we're talking about and the policies that people are fighting for, there actually is a lot more consensus than it seems like there is. It's just the way it gets pitched is there are, you know what I mean?
Well, on gun reform, for example, I mean, you see the polling and it's like universal background checks. It's what is it, 90% or something support that, but when it's not being reflected in our governance at all.
We talk about issues sometimes like there's this huge divide, and to some extent that's because when you talk about these issues, you take the sort of fringe positions and then kind of argue about them at the edges. But there's a lot of commonality there, and so his theory has been that that folks who are struggling, folks who have felt ignored by this process, feeling brought in, is that resonates with white working class voters, that resonates with young folks of color, that resonates really with a lot of the groups that people are saying are sort of, in order to get one, you have to lose the other, that isn't actually true.
I think one of the really defining moments of the campaign so far was, this was a few weeks ago, in the aftermath of the horrible shooting in El Paso, where you had a gunman come from East Texas and basically try to kill as many Mexican Americans as he could. And Secretary Castro unveiled an ad which ran only in Bedminster, New Jersey, where Donald Trump was vacationing at that time, and was just basically him standing there, and he's just basically talking about the impact of Donald Trump's rhetoric and what he has done to sort of create this climate, this toxic climate that we have. Can you talk a little bit about the decision? Because this was an unusual approach, and it had a lot of impact, I think. And this was at a time when Secretary Castro, it was not certain yet whether he was going to make the third debate, right? So that was in the balance too. Talk a little bit about what went into the decision to put that together.
Absolutely, yeah. He had been sort of struggling with how to talk about it because it was an attack specifically on the Latino community, and it was somebody who was parroting the rhetoric of the president. That was something that was, the visceral reaction he had to that, was something that we were trying to figure out the best way to kind of deal with. And he also was very conscious that he was like, this isn't going to be, he didn't want to go to the community. Because he did not want to turn it into a political thing. It was different. Beto spent a lot of time in the community, but he lives in El Paso, right? Like that's a very different decision, So, but this was, in a way, this was also an attack on Secretary Castro's community, right? Like, so
absolutely,
he wanted to capture that. He wanted to signal to folks that were feeling that level of just sort of disbelief that could happen, that the president could sort of cede the kind of thinking that would lead to that kind of atrocity. He wanted to speak to them. He wanted to speak to folks who just, who are looking at this and feel like our politics are unrecognizable. But he also genuinely wanted to talk to Donald Trump and say explicitly, this is what you're doing. And the people that are being targeted look like me and they look like my family. And that line being in the ad was something that was so, I think it was such a powerful moment. And it was one of those moments where, regardless of who is watching that ad and how they identify, everyone identifies with that sort of visceral moment of, you're sending people to come after me and my family. Like, enough is enough. And so it was genuinely just from his feeling of, outrage and heartbreak and frustration that was like, we sort of made the decision to do it. And, we didn't want it to seem like a stunt, right? Like it was very clearly in one way.
Which it's a tough thing to find that balance, right?
Right. But the idea was that he was like, I don't just want to like tweet something out there. Like, I want to be saying this to him. And it wound up being something I think that was really powerful, and I think it resonated with a lot of people because it was so personal. And I think a lot of people were feeling really personal about that.
When you look at the primary schedule, obviously we've got the Iowa caucuses at the beginning. You got New Hampshire. Nevada is a state that I know that you all have focused on. I mean, you focused on all these states, but Nevada is one that you all have given a lot of attention to. And then South Carolina, and then you got the big Super Tuesday, which includes Texas and California. Is there any is there a strategy when you look at those first few states? Are you focusing on one, say Nevada among the early states before Super Tuesday, or how are you approaching that?
You know, he made a commitment to visit all 50 states during the primary, right? With the idea that this, of all cycles, is going to be one that, you know, the first 4 states occupy the space that they do in this process, and we know what that is, but that of all cycles, to make sure that everybody feels like this is your primary too, and I'm fighting for your votes, this is the one to do it. So I think, you know, there is a much broader strategy that we're looking at than just those first 4 states. We do think that, you know, there are going to be states that are in play if Secretary Castro were the nominee that maybe a lot of Democrats don't tend to think about. And so we're looking at, you know, Arizona and Florida and, you know, some of the states where we really think that he can be very where his campaign and his candidacy is going to resonate with people. And we want to sort of prove, because I think one of the things that is going to come out of the cycle is we're going to see what the sort of new Democratic coalition needs to look like. And I think that he is someone who is uniquely able to pull together what that new sort of coalition is. This is going to be the first year that Latinx voters make up the second largest voting bloc. But sort of more than that, right? I mean, I think that there are a lot of folks who just have not consistently felt drawn into this process. The excitement that young people express over his campaign and the way that he's running and what he's talking about is really it's really exciting. I think what we're seeing is that he is going to inspire a lot of new voters. Like, you know, sort of in communities across America. So that's a big part of our kind of theory of the case, is that we're going to need to show that the next generation of leadership can pull together the next sort of generation of our political coalition. And so we're really, you know, looking at that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you're really talking about what the kind of thing that Barack Obama did in 2008, where he really kind of, rather than he was trying to appeal to the existing electorate, but he was also building a new one at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, I remember reading some things that, you know, he actually had a lot of independents. He had, honestly, like a number of Republicans were excited about, you know, about
Obamacans or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think he kind of modeled a similar thing, right? Where you build a different coalition, you expand the electorate. I think, you know, that's what we're doing as well. It's probably a different coalition of people, but it's still that sense of these aren't necessarily likely voters. So again, they're probably also not getting polled a lot of times, but there is that energy. That's
how much of a factor do you think is the Republicans recoiling from the GOP in the wake of Trump and even, you know, the Texas legislature?
I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of, I think there are a lot of Republicans who are having to have serious moments with themselves, looking at what the president is doing, whether they want to permanently, you know, sort of tie themselves to this guy and to the stuff that he's doing and this racist rhetoric, this, you know, like that if this is really the future that they want. I do think that that obviously opens an opportunity for Democrats, but I do caution the sort of sense that, well, if Republicans are recoiling, then maybe our politics should be dictated by going after Republican voters. I think that the way, you know, sort of progressive values are genuinely best served is to say, I'm going to stick to my values and I'll meet you where you are. I think that there's a way to do that without giving on sort of the issues. And I think that's the way to take advantage of a moment where Republicans are having those, you know, kind of that moral dilemma of, can I really keep saying that this guy is principled?
So in other words, authenticity is very important.
I think authenticity is a complicated subject when we talk about politics, just because I think,
does it exist in politics?
I mean, right. First, exactly. If you know that you come across a certain way that ultimately helps you, does that transform what is genuine, your genuine personality? Does it transform it to be inauthentic? But I think there's also the question of authenticity. I think authenticity is just a hard concept as particularly when you're talking about candidates of color, because I think that a lot of ways that candidates of color sort of are successful moving through their career is having to make sure that they are coming across a certain way. In order
They're almost
to be
discouraged from being authentic in some way.
And then they reach a certain level in their career, and then it's like, okay, be authentic.
Why aren't you more authentic?
Why aren't you right? And I think that's true of candidates of color. I think it's true of women. I know I read something similar about Hillary Clinton, where, at some point someone was like, she just seems too fake. And someone was like, well, she's been in politics for 30 years. And when she was younger, you all said she was too feminist. And so she corrected. And then you said that she was too, and it was like at each stage, she is being vilified for at its core being a woman. And then she gets to this point in her career and you're like, why aren't you more natural?
I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but I think it's a really good point that, it's there's kind of a real intense mind game that's being played on people.
Do you think that's what initially drew people to Trump, is because they saw him as authentic and
honestly,
almost like a feral animal?
No, for real. I do think that there are a lot of people who saw in Donald Trump this idea that was like, oh, wow, well, I know he's being authentic because no political consultant would tell him to behave that way.
That's true.
And so there's something refreshing about that. The problem is that if he's authentically a racist and he's just authentically an immature child who's running the country, he's being exactly who he is, and it's dangerous, right? But there is something about this
Coloring outside the lines, people are drawn to that.
right? Because it just seems so, I'm getting who you really are.
Liberating,
Like, there's
yeah.
something right like that. Yeah. It's just, if you want someone authentic, you need someone who's going to be authentically at their core good at this job.
Well, before we let you go, I wanted to, to point out, obviously your day-to-day routine is just trying to position your candidate so that he can win the Democratic primary. But there are historical factors here. He's attempting to become the first Latinx president in the history of the United States. You are only the third African-American woman ever to run a presidential campaign. Again, just because of how busy you are just doing the job of running that campaign, I don't know how much time you have to think about that, but do you give much thought to the historical factors at work here?
I think about that every time, whenever he goes anywhere, inevitably someone brings up their kids to meet him, and seeing these little Latinx boys and girls face just light up looking at him with this I always call it this I got next look in my eyes, and it's they're looking at him and you can tell that their imaginations are being broadened as to what they can do. And so I think about that constantly, because I'm always we need to build a campaign that is going to make that generation of people proud and make people feel like this is something that's available. And I think about it, I absolutely think about it for myself too, because I'll go to conferences and things like that. And a number of times people will just come up to me afterwards, and young Black women who are, excited about going to politics and just want to ask questions or say hi and say, it matters. Representation matters, and watching it matter in real time, watching people's minds sort of expand about what they can do because they're seeing someone else do it. You can't not think about it, and you can't not get excited about it.
Well, obviously the next debate is on the 12th. Can't help but ask. First debate, he had a memorable moment challenging Beto O'Rourke on immigration. Then in the second debate, challenging former Vice President Biden on immigration. Anything we can look for in this one? I know you're not going to tell us, but I can't help but ask.
His brother will be in the audience. Maybe he can call him out on something.
There you go.
No, honestly, I think more than anything, what we're prepping for really, with a smaller stage, it's 10 people and just one night. I really do think there is a little more freedom.
Right.
People will get maybe a little more time. And so my genuine hope is, one, that he talks about the many other issues that he has talked about beyond immigration. Immigration was the first thing he rolled out, but by no stretch is this campaign sort of defined by that. Right. And so I hope he gets a chance to talk more broadly about his vision and kind of integrating some of this stuff. And I think he presents a very strong contrast with a lot of folks on the stage, and so I'm sure that contrasting will come up. But really, our big hope is that he gets a chance to really sort of on his own terms talk about these, his vision.
Maya Rupert, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with the campaign.
Thank you.
And for those of you all listening, we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.